This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 261 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today's topic is languages and accents. I've got a great collection of stories connected to either foreign languages and foreign accents or our own accents. More on mine in a second. But I thought I'd kick off the episode by actually really dorkily listing a history of my own language learning, just because I actually kind of thought, what am I going to talk about? And I sat down to think about all of the languages I've dabbled in over the years, and it was kind of fun. So if you listened last week to episode 261, you already know my history of learning German from the age of about 7 or 8 in the third grade in primary school. So that remains the only language that I have any decent fluency in. My grammar is not very good because it's very detailed grammar, isn't it, in German, most languages, I suppose. But I don't really love the attention to detail that is required to be correct. And so I just speak really quickly, and most of the time I can get away with that perfectly fine. If I had a job where I had to write in German, then that would be trickier and I'd have to really knuckle down. But other than that, my German's pretty good. That's it. That's all. That's the end of my language any languages that I'm actually decent at. But I wanted to tell you all the others I've dabbled in. So also in primary school, I had a go at Italian. It was in, I think, a year or so, maybe 2, I can't remember, a long time ago, in an extension course I was going to. Now this is a really geeky confession, I did a correspondence course in Esperanto for, quite a while, around the, late tweens, early teens age, I think. Esperanto, if you don't know, is a kind of invented language designed to be easy for everyone to learn, an international language, which is in theory a really great idea, because I actually don't love that by default or by, colonialism, I suppose, that English became kind of the language. I really think that that's not fair, especially for us native speakers. We have such an advantage, which is really nothing we earned. So I like the idea of Esperanto, and it was pretty easy to learn. It had regular rules and stuff, unlike English. But you don't hear about it as much these days. Anyway, so that was that. In high school, I learnt Mandarin for a couple of years. It was, I really liked it, but I wasn't really good at it. As a tonal language, I found the pronunciation really difficult. And we actually had trouble in those high school years, so this is in the late 80s, getting a teacher. We had 3 or 4 different teachers within 18 months, so I think the school stopped offering it not long after that. But I'd already stopped taking it because, German was much easier. And I wanted to fill up my timetable with other things too. So I think I didn't really try another language until I moved to Japan. And so, of course, just before I moved to Japan, I did a short course in Japanese, ready to get a little bit of speaking, some basics up before I went, especially since I was going to be living there for a while. And I ended up spending 2 years there, and I had my favourite ever language lessons in my second year there in a group. Well, actually, there was groups of us, but we all had our own one-to-one Japanese tutor in a room in East Osaka every Thursday morning, and it was just so much fun. Still love thinking back to those lessons. And I've since then also dabbled in Spanish off and on, because I really love the idea of speaking Spanish, but I've never really committed, so I have a very, very basic level. And the only other accent I felt like I dabbled in was recently, or a few years back before we went to Denmark. I did spend a good amount of time on Duolingo learning some Danish so that I could at least use, some decent basics while I was in Denmark. Of course, everyone in Denmark speaks English perfectly, but they did indulge me and let me at least use some, some basic phrases at the shops and stuff in Danish, so that was fun. Now, just briefly before our first guest, as I said, this episode is about languages and accents. And I know I sometimes get feedback from people in other countries to say they like my Australian accent, but I have to say, if I listen too hard, I find it a bit embarrassing. And my most embarrassing moment was when I was living and working in Japan, and I was teaching kids as part of my work there, teaching 3 to 6 year olds, in fact. And so obviously when they were like the 3 or 4 year olds, I was the only English teacher they had ever had. And so they kind of, they got my accent. And I always remember we always used to start the classes. We had to talk about what day it was and stuff. And I remember so clearly after a couple of months hearing these kids who had, could now speak some sentences, but they'd got my accent. And I'd say, what day is it today? And they'd say, today is Wednesday. And all I could hear was the worst Aussie twang being reflected back at me. And it was all my fault. So I often think there's a group of kids who've grown up with their first influence being Aussie English, and they probably sound quite odd now. But anyway, we'll see. Now, I moved on to accents because my first guest today is Helena Fox. And it's because of her accent that I actually got in touch with her. A friend and I were watching an Australian Society of Authors webinar a few months back, and Helena Fox, who's an author, was one of the speakers. And my friend and I spent some time discussing her accent, trying to decide what it was. I wouldn't say arguing about it, but discussing, trying to decide. And so I thought, well, the only way to resolve this is to get in touch. So I actually did speak to Helena and ask about her background. And of course, we had a much longer chat, but here's a small part of it which is relevant to this topic of languages and accents.
Well, it all started when my parents met each other in San Francisco in the US. And then they got married there. My dad was from the UK and my mum's from Australia. And they met over there and they got married, and then they got pregnant and decided to move to Mexico to have my sister. As you do. And then
why not?
And then they thought, actually, we don't want to. So they were in Guadalajara in Mexico, and then they decided they wanted to go to Chile. And so they packed up their station wagon and they padded up the whole station wagon. So my sister was able to crawl around in the back of the station wagon while they went south. So they crossed across the Panama Canal. And then they drove down to Chile and met my grandparents there. And they were going to stay there, but I think that was when Allende it was not politically safe to stay. Right. So they drove back up and landed in Lima, Peru, where I was born.
Wow.
And my mum, in fact, she climbed up to Machu Picchu with me in her belly. So I can say that I went to Machu Picchu.
But you don't remember it.
No. And then, gosh, I was there for this really enormous earthquake. 100,000 people, I think, over 100,000 people died. And I was in my little cot as the flat was shaking. And my mum ran up and got us and ran down with 2 children. So I survived that.
Oh, gosh.
And my parents were going to settle there. But then my parents actually separated. And so for a little while, I went with my mum and my sister to Barcelona in Spain. And so still speaking Spanish.
Yeah.
So we lived, and I went to a little school in Spain. And I think it was lots of little stories I hear about that, where the headmistress, I think you were meant to eat your fruit with a knife and fork. Ooh. So we still joke about that. It was a very kind of proper school, and you had to be very ladylike. So I was still tiny, so I don't remember a lot of that. But then we went to the UK where my parents reunited. And so I lived in Reading in just west of London. And that's where I learned English.
So how old were you by the time you got to England?
I was about 5.
Right.
So I remember being in this classroom kind of hiding in the kitchen area, there was a play kitchen. And I went inside this little plastic contraption. And I remember looking out the window of this plastic contraption and seeing a sea of faces, and I didn't know what anyone was saying.
Oh, wow.
And my parents were told by someone who I guess they thought was an authority, they were told not to speak Spanish to us, to help us learn English. And so not only did I lose my country, or my childhood country, I lost my language. And so that's I do still feel the loss of that. I still think, my goodness, that's my birth language, and when I've studied Spanish since, it comes back really quickly, but a lot of it is, isn't there. And I also only had a 5-year-old's vocabulary, so but it was hard to be new there and get to know, the ways, and I was a pretty timid child, and so it was just quite a shock. And my sister was older, and she had to learn the language, and she found it much harder because she was about 7. So, but then of course I got my little accent, and that was I would say, that's one of the things that you're probably hearing in my accent is my British accent. And so I used to say water and butter. That was my accent then.
Oh, cute.
Yeah. And so then, I was pretty settled at that point. But then my parents moved again, and we moved to Australia when I was 8. And that's when I went to school for a little while and tried to get to know. We were in the North Shore of Sydney. It was all went to a little school there, and we were just settling in when my mum got a job in Samoa.
Oh,
so
wow.
After we went to, at the time it was called Western Samoa. So I was 8 and I went to this country, and we lived in first we lived out in a village out of town. And the first night we arrived, we went to sleep in our kapok mattresses, which are all filled with kapok down. And you had to leap to get into the middle of your mattress because it was you would tilt out of your bed otherwise. So I remember lying in there, and all the louvered windows were open, and these kids from the village had discovered that these palangis, that's for white people, had arrived in this house, in this village. And I remember going to sleep with all these eyes watching me. All the children of the village had come and just to see who we were, and they'd come and were gazing in at us as we slept.
Such a varied and interesting childhood, hey, which of course explains the accent that my friend and I couldn't quite place. I've got some more stories from Helena and her time on Samoa and others, which I'll share in future episodes. Now, my next guest today is Carolanna Lisonbee, and Carolanna has experience learning Chinese and Japanese. And I was fascinated to chat to her about this because, well, I think the reasons she dive deeper into these languages are pretty cool.
The reason I started studying it was because I love Japanese poetry. I love haiku and tanka, and so I wanted to be able to read it in the original language, but the high school I went to didn't offer Japanese, and so I was like, I'll take Chinese then, because then at least I'll be able to read the kanji.
Yep. That's so cool. What a great reason.
So now I've actually, since the pandemic started and I've had a whole lot more time on my hands, I've been translating some Chinese poetry.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
It's really, really fun. It's like, it feels like excavating buried treasure.
I can imagine. And I don't know enough about it, but I can assume from what I know of Chinese and Japanese, the way their language is, I always find it's sort of, well, I don't know the best way to describe it. It's concise because a single character says a lot compared to, several longer words of ours. So I feel like they would write in a different way.
In Chinese, in the spoken language, there's a lot of homophones. So you do have to use a lot of compound words to convey your meaning. But in the language, because basically every character has a different meaning, in poetry, it is a lot more abbreviated than the spoken languages, because you see a character that in the spoken language could be all sorts of different words, but seeing it as a character, you know what word it is.
Mm-hmm. Right. I can understand. Yeah. Wow. So translating would be amazing. That is very, very cool. I love that. I learnt Mandarin in high school for 2 years, and I was really shocked because I'd learnt German for years and I was good at German. And then I learnt Mandarin for a couple of years and I didn't get great grades. And I was a bit shocked because I had considered myself someone who was good at languages. But it turns out Mandarin is really hard. So
it is.
And the tones, I really struggled with the tones. I don't know if my ears are not, I don't know if I'm not good at my listening is not good or something, but I found that really hard.
It takes a lot of practice to be able to distinguish tones if you don't speak a tonal language to begin with.
Right, I can believe that. So I really admire anyone who can do well with Mandarin. So Japanese in comparison is easy, I think.
Well, Japanese, the pronunciation is a lot easier, but the grammar is a little bit more complicated.
That's true, yeah.
Coming to it from English, which is a very, distributive language, and then you go to Japanese, where the word order is different.
That's true.
And you put so much different information into verb endings.
Yes. Yeah, that part's hard, you're quite right.
So Japanese and Chinese are very difficult, but they're difficult in different ways, completely different ways.
Yeah, that makes sense. Am I right in remembering that in Mandarin the word order is similar to English?
It is.
Yeah.
It's generally similar to English. So English has a subject, verb, object word order. Japanese has the subject, object, verb word order. And in Mandarin, they have a topic, comment word order, which usually breaks down to a subject, verb, object word order.
Okay.
It's similar to English on the surface.
Yes.
The big difference grammatically is that a lot of prepositional phrases will come in different parts of the sentence than they would in English.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Anyway.
Oh, that's cool. Oh, I love it. I keep one day on this, as I said, when I have all this mythical time again, I really want to get back into Japanese. Like when I was there, I'd learnt quite high conversational level, I suppose. And we had these gorgeous one-to-one teachers. Because they had these housewives who would teach us for free. They were volunteers, but they'd learnt to teach Japanese as a foreign language. And I just loved that class. And I'd learnt so much. But then, I moved on and I lived in other countries and it was hard to keep up my Japanese. And I'd really hoped my son would be able to learn it. But here, the only language they're offering these days is French. So I'm trying to learn a bit of French because I figure if he's learning French, it'd be fun to keep up. But really, I would love to go back to Japanese.
I'm studying French right now on my own because I've never been to Europe, and I really, really wanted to go to Paris. So I planned a vacation to Paris. I had it scheduled. I had my itinerary written down and the plane tickets bought.
Oh no!
For April 2020.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
So not yet.
I'm still studying French, and by the time I actually get there, French will be nice.
There you go. See? A blessing in disguise.
Well, not so much a blessing, but a consolation prize.
Okay, that is a better description of it. You're quite right. So I hope Carolanna has since or soon been able to put her French to use as well. I must check back in. Now, my final guest today is Lindsay Williams from Lindsay Does Languages, so you can tell from her business and website that she is pretty obsessed with languages, and I asked her to give us some practical tips on language learning for travellers.
Like you say, before and during and even after to a certain extent, but it definitely starts before, and it doesn't have to start with. I think a lot of the difficulty around language learning is that we think it's all or nothing. You know, you have to finish the course or you know nothing. You have to be completely fluent or what's the point? And that is just not the case. And so in terms of before your trip, you want to be thinking about those essential phrases that you'll need. So, if you've been somewhere before and you're thinking, okay, what have I wanted to say in the past? When I've been at a street food stand, what have I wanted to order? What would I have needed to ask for something, right? And there's the obvious ones, isn't there? Like hello, like a greeting of some kind, a goodbye greeting, like the opposite of a hello. So hello, goodbye, yes, no, please, and thank you. They're your 6 essential words. That's boom, done.
Yep.
And then thinking, okay, where do you expand from there? And it's not necessarily the obvious, my name is Lindsay, I live in England, I speak English, like that stuff. I don't know about you, but if I'm traveling, I don't just go up to someone in a restaurant and say, hello, my name is... You don't really use that.
No, it's always the first thing in textbooks, isn't it? But it's actually not very
Yeah.
practical when you travel.
Exactly. You don't need that introduction at step one. So you can shelf that until a little bit later on and actually learn some more useful conversation starters. So, for example, learning how to say things like, oh, it's hot, or oh, it's cold, isn't it? Or oh, this food is delicious. Those kind of things. Or even just in the purest form, oh, hot, oh, cold, delicious. Just one word, right? If the phrase itself is kind of a bit complex in the language you're learning, the language that you need, just go for those single words where you can then communicate what you're feeling, and what you're experiencing, and see if someone else is having that kind of mutual experience, like if it's the weather, hot, cold, if it's the food that you're eating around the same table and being able to say it's delicious. So those words are really, really useful, I've found. And then when it comes, you might want to think about as well, getting a phrase book. They can be useful. You might find that actually for your trip, you don't need a phrase book because they can also be quite thorough for the size that they are. They can be really, really thorough. So you might not need that at all. You might just be fine to get along with, and people blaspheme it to high heaven, but Google Translate is not the devil.
No, it's really not. I mean,
it's really, really
it's an amazing tool.
Yeah, it is, especially for travel. And you can do the little speaky thing, where you say something and it translates. Like I checked into a hotel in Korea once, and the guy, and I speak a bit of Korean, but in just enough. And the guy spoke zero English. So he felt much more comfortable saying what he needed to say in Korean into his phone, into Google Translate, showing me, and I'd be like, there, like nodding and agreeing in Korean, And so Google Translate, yeah, absolutely don't
knock it.
Yeah, don't knock it. And then when you're there, there's this, another myth of language learning is that immersion, right? This idea of when I'm there, click, it will all just happen and it will all just fall into place.
Yes, exactly.
No, this is not true. Because, when you're there, you do have the advantage of visually, at the very least, being able to look around and see shop signs as you go past on the bus or the train, in that language, and you can see it all around you. Maybe you can even hear people talking in it. But unless you are actively going out and seeking chances to use the language, it's not going to happen. And one of my favorite ways that I found during a trip to do this is with things like Airbnb experiences. And there's others in different parts of the world, like in Southeast Asia, and I think in kind of more South Asia as well, like India and Nepal, perhaps. I think Backstreet Academy do these kinds of experiences.
So there are other heard of them. I must look that up.
Yeah, they're really good. Where you can do like a calligraphy class or a cooking class or, a music class or things like this. So good, because you don't have to do them completely in the language. The hosts will most likely, if the profile for the experience is in English, the host most likely speak a bit of English.
Yeah.
But you can be asking and you can be practicing your bits of language that you've learned with a native speaker who is there and who you're paying for their time.
Yes.
Because thing.
And they must be interested in meeting tourists, or travelers.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. This is the other myth that comes alongside this immersion, is that, well, when I'm there and people will be grateful for me practicing the language, which is true, but then the extension of that is, and they will be patient with me. Well, not necessarily. Most people we encounter in travel, they are there to do a job, and they're there to do that job the quickest way possible. And if that means switching to English because they recognize that your language skills maybe aren't that strong, that's what they're going to do, right? You can't blame them for that. You can't get frustrated. You just have to accept, okay, they've gone to English, no worries. But if you're having an experience like that with someone, you're in a cooking class, you pay that person for their time. So you can, ask like, oh, how do I say, chili, or how do I say rice, and things like that. And you can learn these words as you go, and you can learn the expressions that come along with those experiences as well. And another extension of that, if you want to take things even further and have actual immersion is to a homestay or like a workaway experience where you are staying with people. You have much more active immersion opportunities then within that place. It's not just a hotel where the staff speak English because it's the international language of travel, right? So things like that are a really, really great way to take advantage. And then, of course, like I said, you can take it on after your trip as well. So if you, during the trip, you can be collecting like free leaflets. I'm such a sucker for this. Like if I go to like McDonald's, I would take the little paper thing on the tray and be like, I'm going to translate that later.
I'm the same.
You can collect all of these little things and then take them home, and then you've got something for after. You can even buy books and resources while you're there as well that may not be available in your country or online, and you can take things further after your trip as well. So you can use it as a spark of inspiration to go beyond when you return. Yeah. And of course, you want to return again. So it's a lovely cycle.
Yes, well, that's right. Exactly. Because then you've got something to work towards to know more of the language the next time you visit. I love doing a return trip. I love Lindsay's really practical suggestions here, and I agree that doing things where you get to hang out with locals for half a day or a day or more and have a bit of kind of captive time to practice some language with them is a really, really fabulous idea and something I have tried out in the past and will continue to do so. So, thank you for listening to episode 261 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. I hope you've enjoyed these tales of languages and accents, and I would love to hear more about your own language experiences. So, hop over to the Facebook group for Thoughtful Travellers and chat with us there. You can find a link in the show notes, or just search for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook, or likewise, if you prefer LinkedIn, come and find us there. The best way to find that group is just to use the shortcut notaballerina.com/LinkedIn. Big thanks, of course, to my fabulous guests. I started off chatting with Helena Fox, and you can find more about her at helenafoxauthor.com. And I do recommend her young adult fiction, her novel, How It Feels to Float. I'll leave a link in the show notes. I read it after we'd met and loved it. Carolanna Lisonbee is also a poet, and as you could hear by her interests in languages, her poetry collection is available on Amazon. It's called Wisp of Fog Moment, and I'll leave a link for that as well. And last but absolutely not least, Lindsay Williams' site is Lindsay Does Languages at lindsaydoeslanguages.com. Lots of cool info there. All of these links and more will be in the show notes. And for this episode, the show notes are at notaballerina.com/261. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.